Hello, dear students of poetry, and welcome to our 12th lecture for today. I hope that you are doing very well and life is good with you, and I hope that you are safe at home. Today, our lecture is going to be about the difference between objective types of poetry and subjective types of poetry. Having reached this stage of our course means that we have covered almost 2/3 of the course and we are left with 1/3. The coming lectures are going to be basically about the differences that exist between one type of poetry and another. Today, let us start by talking about the difference between objective and subjective poetry. Many people believe that dividing poetry into objective and subjective is just meant for academic purposes because the line that divides objective from subjective might be a very, let us say, a very thin one, because objective can sometimes interpenetrate with subjective and vice versa. First of all, let us speak about the meaning. Before we go to talk about poetry, let us talk about meaning. Objective is basically associated with fact. Subjective is associated with opinion. Um, like for example, if you have an exam that you can describe as objective, this exam is basically testing your knowledge of certain facts, and therefore you know that the answers are set by the teacher, and usually they agree on them easily, and there is no difficulty in deciding whether the question is right or wrong. Examples of these exams include uh, objective exams, true, false, match, fill in the missing blanks. But when we speak of subjective exams, for example, we speak about questions like, in your opinion, is Hamlet, for example, a reluctant character or not? Is this character good or evil? In your opinion, what should have been done, etc. So these types of questions are related to opinion. And usually, students can answer these questions in their own ways. They can get good grades even though they answered in different ways. But the problem with subjective exams is that they are controlled by the opinion of the person who corrects the exam. Exactly like when we say that this person is objective, whereas the other person is subjective. Often, when I say an objective person, it means that this person does not allow his likes and dislikes to interfere with his or her judgments. Whereas a subjective person is affected by his own opinions, likes, and dislikes, and often he allows these things to interfere with his or her judgment. Now, in general, when we say that objective and subjective, linguistically speaking, are opposites. Therefore, we often associate the subjective with saying anything where we use our personal opinions, feelings, or points of view. And we use the objective when the information we have is basically factual, based on observations and measurements. So subjective means personal, resulting from feelings existing only in the mind. Objective means real, factual, without bias, which means that the subjective can be biased, whereas the objective cannot be biased. Now, the difference between these two important ideas is the difference between fact and opinion. We often believe that facts are objective and provably true. That is, we can prove them. However, if there is no clear um, thing about the topic, then we can have a series of balanced opinions to allow readers to make up his or her minds. So, opinions are subjective ideas held by individuals, and so are always biased. An objective piece of information, therefore, needs either to be the whole truth and at least be unbiased or balanced. Whereas a subjective point of view is biased because it is either not the complete picture or it is merely a viewpoint or expression of feelings. So, if we speak, for example, about science and math, we speak of objective things. But if we speak of literature, for example, we notice that it is subjective. It is basically based on viewpoints and expressions of feelings, and they are different from one person to another person. Okay, now let us move to our book, page 87, and try and see what our book says about the difference between subjective and objective poetry. The first thing I want you to know is that subjective poetry has been associated with civilization, whereas objective poetry has always been associated with primitive life. That is, when human beings started to live on Earth, actually, they had basic needs, and these basic needs were seen as their priority. So, what kind of poetry would exist at that time? It would be the poetry that is suitable for the entire group. It takes into consideration the well being of the tribe. Whereas subjective poetry has been associated with civilization, that is, when man started to see himself as an individual and when he transcended the idea that I'm just looking for the basic needs. Human beings now satisfied their basic needs and they started to think about their own feelings, thoughts, and ideas. And that's why most of the specialists in the field view objective poetry as something that started with primitive life and subjective poetry as a kind of poetry that is associated with civilization. Now, poetry actually treats of two kinds of subject matter, and these two subject matters are objective and subjective. If we start with the first difference between subjective and objective poetry, we will say that objective poetry is supplied by external objects, deeds, and events. That is, the focus is on externalities. The focus is on deeds, not thoughts. Also, events, what happens around us. Notice, for example, that an important type of objective poetry is the epic. And the epic has for its subject matter battles, actions, fights, duels, and such stuff. Whereas if we think of subjective poetry, it is supplied by the poet's own thoughts and feelings. So the material of subjective poetry is the thoughts and the feelings of the poet. When the poet gives focus to his mind and to his heart, he is not focusing on what's happening. He is focusing on what he feels about what's happening around him or around her. The second important difference is that in objective poetry, the poet functions as a detached observer. A detached observer. So what's his task? Actually, it is just describing what he has seen or heard. This is his job, just to describe what he has seen or heard. So here, the poet does not put himself inside the literary work. For example, when we read Paradise Lost, which is an epic written by the great writer John Milton, do we know any information about Milton's mind, thoughts, ideas, and beliefs? I mean, as an individual? No. Also, if we read the Iliad or the Odyssey, we will never know anything about the life of Homer or how Homer feels. He is just reporting facts. He is detached from the action. This also applies to ballads when we think of ballads. If you try to remember any ballad you know, like one of the most famous ballads, Sir Patrick Spins, I don't think that when we read the ballad, we will be able to know any information about the life of the writer, who is an unknown writer. It is only a description of Sir Patrick Spins's feelings, I mean problems, and there is nothing about the author. Now, if we think of subjective poetry, we notice that the poet brings his own reflections upon what he has seen or heard. That is, the poet doesn't see himself as a reporter of facts. The poet is a person with opinions, views, and standpoints, and therefore, as he discusses his subject matter, he brings his own ways of seeing such things. So he brings his own reflections upon the matter that he is dealing with. The other thing is the objective writer views his subject from without. That is, the poet confines himself merely to the externals. He confines himself merely to the externals. Therefore, his treatment is objective. On the other hand, we notice that the subjective poet views his subject from within. He views his subject from within. And what does that mean? It means that he gives expression to his thoughts and feelings. Or let me say that if the poet views the subject from within, it means that he brings his thoughts and feelings to the surface. That is, what things are aroused in his mind while treating the subject. And one might put it more briefly by saying that objective poetry is impersonal, whereas subjective poetry is personal. Impersonal treatment means that the poet keeps himself outside the poem. He doesn't talk about himself, his feelings, his thoughts, or ideas while writing his poem. Whereas the subjective poet is a person who focuses on his personal beliefs and ideas. So his treatment can be best described as personal treatment. It's personal treatment. So the objective poetry also has a certain type of focus, which is the focus of attention is outward. The focus of attention is outward. Like, for example, a praiseworthy act, a thrilling occurrence, a beautiful sight. Whereas if we think of subjective poetry, the poet himself actually is the focus. So his mind is centered on his own thoughts and and feelings. So the focus of attention is inward. how the poet sees things and reflects his feelings on them. I think nothing can be clear without examples. So for today, we are going to cite two poets. One of them is a follower of the classical school of thought, and this is William Shakespeare, who was born in 1564 and died in 1616. We will cite an example of a poem that can be seen as an objective poem. And after we are done with Shakespeare, we will move on and talk about Coleridge's poem. And let me tell you where you can find this. It is page 88 of your book, page 88. The poem is entitled Youth and Age. And the poem by Coleridge is also about youth and age. And by using these two poems, I'm going to illustrate the difference between the two methods of treatment. I mean the subjective and the objective. Now, both poets are going to talk about age and youth, a very common topic. So let us see how each one of them deals with the topic. The first one is Shakespeare, Age and Youth. Let us read the poem first and then try to analyze it, and after that see whether it's subjective or objective. Crabbed age and youth cannot live together. Youth is full of pleasance. Age is full of care. Youth like summer morn. Age like winter weather. Youth like summer brave. Age like winter bare. Youth is full of sport. Age's breath is short. Youth is nimble. Age is lame. Youth is hot and bold. Age is weak and cold. Youth is wild and age is tame. Okay? Okay. Now let us see how Shakespeare deals with the topic. We notice that according to the poet, crabbed age and youth cannot live together. And the crabbed here means an old man. The line means that a young and old have different ways of life. We can say they have differences of earth and sky. They are really different. Okay? And how are they different according to the poem? Their opinions, interests, perspectives, and habits are opposite to each other. Yes. Therefore, due to the sharp contrast between the two, they cannot remain happy with each other. So they are as different as cheese and chalk, as they say. This is line 1 and line 2. Crabbed age and youth cannot live together. Now line 3. Youth is full of pleasance. Age is full of care. The word pleasance means pleasing. Yes, pleasing. The line means that a young person always seeks pleasure and does things which please him or her, while an older rather believes in care and precautions. A young person hates precautions, while an old hates pleasure seeking habits. Again, a big difference between the two. A young person always seeks to satisfy his pleasures, and he does a lot of things just to please himself or herself, while the old person is always uh, taking precautions and is actually concerned about things that will happen in the future. A young person doesn't want to be calculating, and the old man lost interest in pleasure seeking actually. So, again, this is a big difference. Age is full of care, youth like summer morn. Now, what does he mean by that? In the line that I have just read, the poet again repeats the same thing. According to him, youth is summer brave, while age is winter bear. Brave here means something like lavish, and bear means miser. A young man spends his life lavishly, while old rather believes in fulfilling the needs. This is one meaning, that a young person would like to live a luxurious life, whereas an old person believes in just fulfilling the important needs. So yes, brave here, I think, is a word that has a certain meaning in our time, but I believe that it had a different meaning in the past. But if we want to take the literal meaning as we have it today, it also fits the poem. Like young people are always courageous, brave, and they are daring, whereas the old people are bare. That is, they are more or less conservative and they want to keep themselves safe. Again, a big difference. Youth like summer, brave, age like winter bear. Yes, youth is full of sport, age's breath is short. This line means that a young person is energetic and adventurous. He believes in doing dangerous things, while an old person is too weak to do that. He rather believes in taking a rest. Yes, I would say that the breath here could be something literal or something which is figurative. Shortness of breath is not only physical, uh, and if we think of it as physical, it could be a reference to energy and adventures. But if we take the figurative meaning, it also means loss of patience. Old people are not patient. They lose interest very quickly, and they cannot bear difficult things like they used to do in the past. So it could be a literal shortness of breath when the person starts to have problems, respiratory problems because of aging, like they cannot climb mountains, they cannot raise the stairs. They often feel vulnerable and weak. And it could also mean loss of patience and tolerance. Whereas a young person is adventurous and also has patience and tolerance of difficulties and even of stupid people. Whereas the old people usually lose breath very easily. Youth is nimble, age is lame. Okay. Um, Actually, young people are passionate, courageous, and flexible, while old is lame, weak, and cold. Neither quick nor flexible, but rather slow, because they are weak, depressed, and like winter, they are rigid. Youth is wild, zealous, focused, brave, while age is lame, gentle, and weak. Notice that um, lame is a person who has difficulty in walking. Probably he has a broken leg or something. And nimble refers to swiftness of movement, when the person can move quickly in a very swift manner. The person is nimble. And also, it's nice to know that we have a nice expression in English, which is a man of nimble wits. Nimble also means a person who is a quick-witted, can think in a very effective and efficient way, and can give you an answer very quickly. I think it applies in both cases, whether we speak of the mind or the body of the old person. The body and the mind of the old person is like lame, whereas the body and the mind of the young person is nimble. So old people are not as strong and zealous as the young people. Age is weak and cold. Age is weak and cold, yes. If we think of old people, they are weak. They are weak. Whereas if we think of the young people, they are they are strong. And the poet tries to sum up by telling us that youth is wild and age is lame. Is tame. Youth is wild. I think the writer here used two opposite words, and these two opposite words are really meaningful in the context that we are talking about. When a person is wild, it means that the person cannot be easily controlled. The person becomes out of control. And you know, when you are young, you are like that. Young people are out of control. And actually, they are like a wild creature. You know, when we think of wild creatures, we think of lions, tigers, but when we think of tame animals, we might think of a rabbit, for example. So the writer is trying to sum up by using these two strong words. The old person is very much like uh, a tame uh, a tame animal, whereas the young person is like a wild animal. You know, when you are young, you are courageous, you're strong, you you want miracles to fall from the sky. But when you are old, you become reserved, and you don't want to do anything except by uh, keeping yourself safe. If we want to think of some of the literary techniques in the poem, we notice that we have the use of simile, youth like summer morn, in which he likens youth to summer morning. Also, age like winter, whether he likens age or old age to winter. Youth like summer brave, he likens youth to summer. So basically, the poet used similes in the poem at least three times. But did you notice the overuse of antithesis in the poem? Antithesis. Like the biggest antithesis in the poem is the last one. Youth is wild and age is tame. But there are many other examples. For example, you have youth is full of pleasance, age is full of care. This is antithesis. Youth like summer morn, age like weather, like winter weather is another antithesis. Youth like summer brave, age like winter bear. This is another antithesis. Youth is full of sport, age's breath is short is another antithesis. Youth is nimble, age is lame. Yes, this is a big example of antithesis. So notice the poem uses a lot of similes and it uses a lot of antithesis. And I think each one of these figures of speech has a function. And the function is to draw sharp contrasts between youth and old age. So basically, the poem has a number of themes, but basically the biggest theme is celebration of youth. The poet describes the benefit of being young. According to him, a young person can do anything. It's courageous, lavish, pleasure seeking, passionate, brave, and adventurous. Unlike the old man who is weak, lame, joyless, cautious, and prefers rest over any other activity, actually. So, this poem can be a good example also of a generation gap. Due to these differences between young people and old people, we start to have a generation gap between the parents and their children because both have different perspectives of seeking the thing. And you know how the old try to force the young, to live their life and to have the same dreams. Yes? Okay. So now, is this poem subjective or objective? I leave this to you. You are the ones who will tell me what kind of poem is this. But before doing so, you have to ask yourself the following questions. Did Shakespeare in this poem talk about, for example, his age when he wrote the poem? Can we come to know how old Shakespeare was when he wrote this poem? Do we have any description? Do we have any description of Shakespeare's feelings about growing old? Actually, if you answer these questions, you will be able to know. Another important thing that I want you to notice, did Shakespeare use first person pronouns of any sort? Using pronouns can be a key way of knowing whether the poem is subjective or objective. You know why? It's because when you think about it, people who reflect their own thoughts and ideas, that is, people who are subjective, most of the time keep using something like I, my, mine. So, did you notice that Shakespeare in this poem, did you notice that he used any of these pronouns? If you look at the poem again, don't you notice that Shakespeare is stating facts? And probably we find it hard to disagree with Shakespeare about what he is saying in the poem, because what he is doing is just to show the difference between old people and young people. I didn't notice that Shakespeare tried to explore the internal side of the old people. He didn't try to go deep into their psyche or into their minds. So please write to me in your questions and comments. Write the most important characteristics of this poem, and tell me why is it objective or subjective according to your own knowledge of the difference between subjective and objective poetry. So here we come to the end of our lecture for today. Our next lecture is going to be an analysis of Coleridge's poem about youth and age, and inshallah we will be using Coleridge's poem in order to show the difference between subjective and objective poetry. And actually, one important thing that I want you to keep in mind before we start next time is the difference between a poet who belongs to the classical school, and I mean Shakespeare, and a person who belongs to the romantic school, and I mean Coleridge. Don't forget that Coleridge belongs uh, to the school of pioneers in the field of romantic poetry, and that he was a master of expressing feelings and thoughts about life. So please read the poem very carefully, and till we meet, I wish that you would spend nice times with your family. Thank you very much for being with me. See you next time with Coleridge and Age and Youth. Thank you.